The jungle breathed with 1,000 hidden voices as Lieutenant James Hartley crouched behind a moss-covered embankment, his fingers trembling against the stock of his Lee Enfield rifle. 23 years old, and already he felt ancient, aged by 12 months of fighting through Burma's merciless terrain. The monsoon rains had finally ceased 3 days prior, leaving the air thick and oppressive, clinging to skin like a second uniform. Hartley wiped sweat from his brow and glanced at the men of his platoon. 32 Marines scattered along the defensive perimeter surrounding the railway bridge at Kaikata. They had been ordered to hold this position for 48 hours, while the main battalion repositioned 15 miles north. Simple enough on paper, but nothing in Burma was ever simple. Private Tommy Mitchell sat closest to Hartley, barely 19, his boyish face smudged with mud and exhaustion. The kid had joined them only 6 weeks ago, fresh from training in India, still carrying photographs of his sweetheart back in Manchester. Hartley remembered being that young once, though it felt like a lifetime ago. Next to Mitchell was Corporal Davies, a Welshman with steady hands and a dark sense of humor that kept the men sane during the worst moments. Further along the line were Jackson, O'Brien, and Peterson, good men all, veterans who had survived Arakan and knew the Japanese well enough to fear them properly. The bridge itself was a rickety wooden structure spanning a muddy river that snaked through the valley below. British engineers had reinforced it hastily 3 months prior when this sector became a supply route. Now it represented the only viable crossing point for vehicles within 30 miles. Intelligence suggested the Japanese were pushing south, probing for weak points in the Allied lines. Command needed this bridge intact for their own movements, but denied to the enemy. Hartley's orders were explicit: hold at all costs. Destroy the bridge only if capture was imminent. He had examined the demolition charges personally that morning, planted by sappers who had departed with the supply convoy at dawn. The plunger sat in a waterproof case beside his position, a last resort he prayed would remain unused. The first sign of trouble came at 1400 hours when the jungle fell silent. Birds stopped calling. Insects ceased their constant drone. Even the river seemed to quiet, as if nature itself held its breath. Davies caught Hartley's eye and nodded grimly. They both knew what that silence meant. The enemy was close, moving through the undergrowth with practiced stealth. Hartley raised his hand, signaling the platoon to full alert. 32 men shifted positions, checking weapons, steadying nerves. Mitchell's hands shook as he gripped his rifle. Hartley wanted to offer reassurance, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and squeezed once, firmly. Mitchell nodded, swallowing hard. The Japanese emerged from the tree line at 14:15, not in their usual banzai charge, but in calculated fire and movement, advancing by sections while others provided covering fire. Hartley estimated at least a company, perhaps more, filtering through the jungle on 3 sides. His platoon was outnumbered 4 to 1, maybe worse. He grabbed the radio handset, calling for artillery support, but the response crackled back negative. The guns were engaged supporting the battalion's main position. No help was coming. They were alone. Hartley made his decision in seconds. They would fight from their prepared positions, make every shot count, hold until nightfall when darkness might offer some advantage. He passed the word along the line. Conserve ammunition. Aim fire only. No panic. The battle began with Japanese mortars walking across their positions, explosions throwing up geysers of mud and shattered vegetation. Hartley pressed himself into the earth as shrapnel whined overhead. When the barrage lifted, the enemy infantry came forward, green-uniformed figures moving in short rushes between cover. The Marines opened fire with disciplined volleys, the crack of Lee Enfields echoing across the valley. Hartley saw Japanese soldiers fall, but more kept coming, relentless, professional. This was no ragtag unit. These were experienced troops, likely veterans of China or the Philippines. They knew their business. The firefight settled into a brutal rhythm. Advance, fire, fall back. The Japanese probed for weaknesses, testing the Marine positions. Davies dropped 3 enemy soldiers in quick succession, his shooting calm and methodical. O'Brien worked his Bren gun in short bursts, conserving the precious belts of ammunition. As afternoon wore into evening, Hartley realized their situation was deteriorating. The Japanese had moved forces to their flanks, threatening to encircle the position. Ammunition was running low despite careful fire discipline. Mitchell had taken a bullet through his left arm, a through-and-through that Davies had bandaged efficiently, but the boy was pale from blood loss and shock. 2 other Marines were dead, killed in the initial mortar barrage. 5 more were wounded to varying degrees. The enemy kept coming wave after wave, accepting casualties that would have broken a less determined force. Hartley understood their strategy now. The Japanese commander was willing to spend lives to take this bridge, grinding down the defenders through sheer attrition. And it was working. At 1900 hours, as tropical darkness fell like a curtain, Hartley gathered his section leaders for a hasty conference behind the command post. Davies, Jackson, and Sergeant Williams crowded close, their faces grim in the fading light. Hartley laid out the situation with brutal honesty. They were nearly surrounded. Ammunition was critically low. The wounded needed evacuation. They could not provide. Williams suggested blowing the bridge and withdrawing under cover of darkness, but Hartley shook his head. Orders were to hold. Besides, the Japanese would simply pursue them through the jungle, picking them off in the darkness. Their only chance was to maintain a defensive position, hope the enemy broke off the attack, or wait for relief that might never come. Then Hartley voiced a thought that had been growing in his mind for the past hour. If the Japanese launched a final assault, if they overran the Marine positions through sheer numbers, there would be one option remaining: close quarters fighting, bayonets fixed, not a charge into enemy fire, but a desperate last stand in the trenches and foxholes, meeting the enemy blade to blade when bullets ran out. The other men stared at him in the darkness. Williams nodded slowly. Davies spat into the mud. Jackson said nothing, but his jaw tightened. They all understood. It might come to that. The most primal form of combat. The nightmare scenario every soldier dreaded but knew was possible. Hartley dismissed them back to their positions and sat alone for a moment, listening to the jungle night, sounds returning cautiously. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the Japanese were regrouping, preparing for another push. And when they came, the Royal Marines would be ready, with bullets if they had them, with steel if they did not. The darkness brought no relief, only a different kind of terror. Hartley moved along the defensive line, checking on his men, offering quiet words of encouragement that fell hollow even as he spoke them. The temperature had dropped with nightfall, and the Marines shivered in their damp uniforms, exhaustion etched into every face. Mitchell sat propped against the trench wall, his bandaged arm cradled against his chest, eyes staring at nothing. Hartley knelt beside him, offering water from his canteen. The boy drank gratefully, then met his lieutenant's gaze with something like apology in his expression. He thought he was letting the unit down, Hartley realized, as if getting shot was somehow a personal failure. Hartley gripped the back of Mitchell's neck firmly, the way his own father had done when he needed steadying, and told him he was doing fine, that staying calm and not panicking was exactly what was needed now. Mitchell nodded, but the fear in his eyes remained. Davies had organized the remaining ammunition into a central depot, counting rounds with meticulous care. The tally was worse than Hartley had hoped. Each rifleman had perhaps 20 rounds remaining. The Bren gun had 2 magazines left. Hand grenades were down to a handful. They had fought well, made every shot count, but mathematics was against them now. Davies reported the numbers in his flat Welsh accent. No emotion, just facts. Hartley thanked him and made a decision. They would hold fire unless targets were certain. Let the Japanese wonder if they had withdrawn. Let them come close, uncertainly, in the darkness. Make the enemy pay for every yard with blood and confusion. It was a gambler's strategy, but they were long past safe options. At 2100 hours, movement rustled in the jungle to their front. Not the cautious probing of earlier, but something more organized, more deliberate. Hartley strained his eyes against the darkness, seeing nothing but shadows and the faint gleam of the river below. Then a flare shot up from the Japanese positions, a magnesium-bright star that turned night into garish day. In that harsh illumination, Hartley saw them, hundreds of soldiers, packed in assault formations, fixed bayonets catching the light like a forest of steel teeth. His stomach dropped. This was it, the final push. The Japanese had gathered their strength for one overwhelming attack, and they were coming now in the darkness with cold steel and overwhelming numbers. The flare died, plunging everything back into blackness, but the image remained burned into Hartley's retinas. He shouted orders, his voice cutting through the night. Every man to his position. Fix bayonets. The command rippled along the line, and Hartley heard the distinctive click and rasp of steel blades locking onto rifle barrels. The sound was medieval, anachronistic, a throwback to warfare from centuries past. Yet here they were, modern soldiers preparing for the most ancient form of combat. Hartley drew his own bayonet, a 17-inch spike of Sheffield steel, and fitted it to his rifle with hands that had stopped trembling. Fear remained, cold and heavy in his gut, but his hands were steady now. Training and discipline had taken over, pushing aside the civilized part of his mind that recoiled from what was coming. The Japanese came in waves, their battle cries tearing through the night like animal howls. Hartley saw them in flashes as more flares went up, faces contorted with aggression, rifles held low for thrusting. The Marines opened fire, each shot carefully aimed, and Japanese soldiers crumpled and fell. But more kept coming, scrambling over their own dead, driven by orders and Bushido and desperation. The range closed terrifyingly fast. 50 yards, 30, 20. Hartley fired his last rounds into the massive bodies, working the bolt mechanically, each shot finding flesh. Then his magazine was empty, and there was no time to reload. The first Japanese soldier reached the trench line, bayonet thrusting, and Hartley met him with his own blade, the impact jarring his shoulders as steel met flesh and bone. What followed was chaos beyond description, a nightmare of grunting effort and screaming men, and the wet sounds of steel entering bodies. The Japanese poured into Marine positions, and the fighting became hand-to-hand, bayonet to bayonet, in the close confines of trenches and foxholes. Hartley fought with mechanical efficiency, thrust and withdraw, but stroke to the face, thrust again. A Japanese soldier lunged at him from the left, and Davies intercepted, his bayonet taking the man through the chest. They fought back to back, Hartley and Davies, two men against a flood of bodies. Time lost meaning. There was only the next threat, the next parry, the next thrust. Mitchell appeared beside them, fighting one-handed with desperate courage, his wounded arm dangling useless, but his good hand driving his bayonet forward again and again. The Marines fought with the fury of cornered animals, giving ground only when forced, making the Japanese pay for every foot of trench. O'Brien used his entrenching tool like a club, crushing skulls with savage efficiency when his rifle jammed. Jackson wrestled hand-to-hand with a Japanese officer, both men's bayonets lost, fighting with fists and boots and teeth in the mud. Sergeant Williams rallied a group of Marines at the bridge approach, forming a desperate last line that held against repeated assaults. The Japanese kept coming, but they were dying too, bodies piling the trenches, blood turning the mud black and slick. The attackers had expected to overwhelm position quickly, but the Marines refused a break, refused a run, selling their lives expensively in the darkness. At some point during that endless night, the character of the fighting changed. The Japanese assault lost momentum, their waves coming less frequently, with less conviction. They had lost too many men to these stubborn defenders, paid too high a price for what should have been an easy victory. Hartley sensed a shift, felt the pressure easing slightly. He rallied the Marines around him, shouting encouragement, organizing the defense by sheer force of will. Davies moved among the wounded, offering what aid he could. Mitchell sat slumped against the trench wall, alive but barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion. Everywhere Hartley looked, he saw Marines who had reached and surpassed their breaking point but kept fighting anyway, held together by training and loyalty and the knowledge that surrender meant death. The Japanese pulled back around midnight, withdrawing into the jungle to regroup and count their losses. The silence that felt was almost worse than the battle, broken only by the groans of wounded men from both sides scattered across the killing ground. Hartley slumped his position, his entire body shaking with delayed shock and exhaustion. His bayonet was crusted with blood and other things he tried not to think about. Around him, the surviving Marine sat in stunned silence, Too tired even to speak, they had held. Against impossible odds, outnumbered and nearly out of ammunition, they had held the position. But the night was not over yet. The Japanese were still out there, and Hartley knew with cold certainty that they would come again before dawn. The enemy had committed too much to this attack to withdraw now. Their commander would want that bridge, and he would send his men forward again and again until the Marines were dead or the bridge was captured. Hartley forced himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, and began moving along the line once more. He counted the survivors. 18 men still able to fight, most of them wounded to some degree. 14 dead, lying where they had fallen. The wounded who could not fight numbered 6, including Mitchell, who had finally passed out from blood loss. 18 men to hold against an enemy force that still numbered in the hundreds. Hartley felt despair trying to claim him, but pushed it down savagely. They had come this far. They would not break now. He gathered his section leaders again, their faces ghostly in the faint starlight. They redistributed the last of the ammunition, 6 rounds per man, 6 bullets to hold until dawn. After that, it would be bayonets again, steel and courage and nothing else. Williams suggested they blow the bridge now, deny it to the enemy and withdraw while they could. But Hartley shook his head. Orders were to hold. Besides, where would they go? Wounded men could not run to the jungle, and he would not leave them behind. They would stay. They would fight. And if dawn came, perhaps relief would arrive. Perhaps. Dawn came slowly to the Burmese jungle, a gradual lightening of the eastern sky that revealed the full horror of the night's fighting. Bodies lay scattered across the approach to the bridge, Japanese soldiers twisted in death, their blood mixing with the red mud. The defensive positions looked like a slaughterhouse, every surface stained dark, spent cartridges glinting among the carnage. Hartley stood at his command post, swaying slightly from exhaustion, and surveyed what remained of his platoon. 18 men, most wounded, all pushed far beyond normal human endurance. They had survived the night, but survival felt less like victory and more like postponement of the inevitable. Davies appeared beside him, offering a canteen of water that tasted of rust and chemicals. The Welshman's uniform was torn and bloodstained, a nasty gash across his forehead crusted black. He had cleaned his bayonet meticulously. Hartley noticed, the blade gleaming despite everything. Davies caught his look and shrugged with dark humor, saying that if they were going to die today, he preferred to do it with proper kit maintenance. Hartley almost laughed, the sound catching in his throat like a sob. How did men joke at times like this? Yet somehow the humor helped, a small assertion of humanity against the inhumanity surrounding them. They stood together in silence, watching the sun rise over a landscape of death, waiting for what would come next. The Japanese attack resumed at 0600 hours, but this time something was different. Instead of mass waves, they came in smaller groups, probing carefully, testing the Marine defenses. Hartley realized the enemy commander had changed tactics, perhaps respecting the defenders' tenacity, perhaps simply being more careful with his remaining troops. The Marines met each probe with disciplined fire, hoarding their precious ammunition, making every shot count. O'Brien dropped the Japanese scout at 200 yards, a magnificent shot that bought them another few minutes. Jackson engaged a machine gun team trying to flank their position, his last grenade landing perfectly among them. Each small victory felt enormous, proof they could still hurt the enemy despite their desperate circumstances. But the mathematics remained unchanged. 6 rounds per man could not hold forever. By 0800 hours, most Marines were down to their last bullets. Hartley had 3 rounds remaining in his pouch, each one representing a life he might take or a life he might save. The weight of that responsibility pressed on him as he moved among his men, checking positions, offering encouragement that felt increasingly hollow. Mitchell had regained consciousness, his face gray with pain and blood loss, but insisted on returning to his position. Hartley wanted to order him to stay down, but they needed every rifle, every man who could fight. So he helped the boy back to his spot in the line and squeezed his shoulder once more. Words unnecessary between them now. The Japanese launched their heaviest assault yet at 0900 hours, coming from 3 directions simultaneously, overwhelming the thin Marine line through sheer numbers. Hartley fired his last 3 rounds into the advancing mass, each shot deliberate, each one finding its mark. Then his rifle was empty, and he had only the bayonet remaining. Around him, other Marines reached the same point, ammunition exhausted, reduced to steel and courage. The enemy soldiers swarmed over defensive positions, and once again the fighting became intimate and terrible. Men killing at arm's length with blade and rifle butt and desperate savagery. Hartley fought beside Davies, then beside O'Brien, then found himself separated, alone against multiple attackers in a collapsed section of trench. A Japanese soldier thrust at him, and Hartley deflected the blade, driving his own bayonet forward in response. The man fell, and another took his place immediately. Hartley's arms burned with exhaustion, his movements slowing, but training carried him through. Thrust, withdraw, parry, thrust again. The mechanical repetition of close combat that drill instructors had beaten into him during training, movements practiced 10,000 times until they became instinct. A blade caught his left side, a burning line of pain that he ignored, focusing only on the next threat. He could hear Davies shouting somewhere to his right, rallying men, organizing resistance. The Welsh corporal seemed indestructible, his voice cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. Then something shifted in the Japanese assault. Hartley sensed it rather than saw it. A hesitation in their attack, a momentary faltering. The enemy soldiers who had been pressing forward with such determination suddenly seemed uncertain. Glancing back toward their own lines, Hartley risked a look over his shoulder, and his heart leaped. British soldiers were pouring across the river to the south, a full company at least, rifles blazing, attacking the Japanese from their rear. Relief had arrived. The main battalion had fought its way back, responding to Hartley's desperate radio calls from the previous day. The Japanese found themselves caught between 2 forces, their assault collapsing into confused retreat. The Marines, sensing salvation, found reserves of strength they did not know they possessed. They drove forward with renewed fury, pushing the enemy back from the defensive positions. Hartley led a counterattack that cleared the trench line, his bayonet red to the hilt, his voice hoarse from shouting. Davies fought beside him, then Mitchell despite his wounds, then others joining until they had reformed something like a cohesive line. The Japanese broke, their retreat becoming a rout as they fled back into the jungle, pursued by fire from the relieving force. Within minutes, the bridge area fell silent except for the groans of wounded and the shouts of British officers organized in position. Hartley stood in the center of his former defensive line, chest heaving, unable to quite believe they had survived. A major from the relieving force approached, his uniform clean and pressed, looking almost obscene in its tidiness compared to mud and blood-covered Marines. The major asked for a situation report, and Hartley gave it mechanically, his voice flat. 18 effectives remaining from 32. 14 confirmed dead, bridge intact and held. Enemy casualties estimated at 400 or more, most killed at close quarters with bayonets when ammunition ran out. The major stared at him, then at the carnage surrounding the position, his face going pale. He asked if they had really killed 400 Japanese soldiers in hand-to-hand combat, and Hartley simply nodded, too tired for elaboration. Medical orderlies arrived, beginning the grim work of treating the wounded and collecting the dead. Hartley watched them load Mitchell onto a stretcher, the boy's eyes finding his lieutenants, conveying gratitude or apology or simply acknowledgement of shared survival. Davies sat nearby, letting a medic stitch the gash on his forehead, smoking a cigarette with hands that finally trembled now that the danger had passed. O'Brien lay on his back, staring at the morning sky, alive but somewhere far away in his mind. Sergeant Williams directed the collection of weapons and equipment with mechanical efficiency, his face blank, processing nothing yet. They had all been changed by what they had endured here. Hartley realized the night of fighting had taken something from each of them that could never be recovered, replaced it with knowledge no man should possess. The major returned an hour later with his colonel, a grizzled veteran who surveyed the battlefield with experienced eyes. He spoke with Hartley quietly, asking detailed questions about the fighting, the tactics employed, the decision to fix bayonets rather than attempt withdrawal. Hartley answered honestly, explaining that they had no ammunition remaining, that the bayonets were not for charging but for defending their positions when overrun, for meeting the enemy blade to blade when no other option existed. The colonel nodded slowly, understanding what Hartley had done, the impossible situation these Marines had faced. He said that he would be recommending several men for decorations, that their stand here had bought crucial time for battalions repositioning, that their sacrifice, though terrible, had not been in vain. But Hartley felt no pride, no sense of accomplishment. He felt only exhaustion and a deep, abiding sadness for the men he had lost and the innocents all of them had left behind in this muddy corner of Burma. They had fixed bayonets not for glory but for survival, had killed at close quarters not from choice but from necessity. The newspapers back home might celebrate their courage, might romanticize their desperate stand, but Hartley knew the truth. There was nothing glorious about what had happened here. Only men doing what they must to survive, to protect each other, to hold a position because orders said hold and training said obey. He looked at Davies, at O'Brien, at the other survivors, and saw the same knowledge reflected in their eyes. They had prevailed, but the cost of that victory would haunt them all for whatever time remained to them. 3 weeks later, Hartley sat in a field hospital tent near Impo, his side wound healing slowly under clean bandages and proper medical care. The doctors had told him he was lucky that the Japanese blade had missed anything vital, that he would recover fully given time and rest. But Hartley did not feel lucky. He felt hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of him that night at the bridge. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, he dreamed of faces. Japanese soldiers he had killed at arm's length, close enough to see their eyes widen in pain and fear. The faces of his own men, those who had died, and those who had survived but been forever altered. The dreams always ended the same way, with him standing alone on that blood-soaked ground, surrounded by bodies that stretched to the horizon. Davies visited on a warm afternoon, walking with a slight limp from a leg wound Hartley had not even noticed during the fighting. The Welshman brought cigarettes and tea, luxuries that felt absurdly normal after what they had endured. They sat outside the hospital tent, smoking in comfortable silence, watching other wounded soldiers shuffle past. Davies eventually spoke, his voice quiet, asking if Hartley had heard about Mitchell. The boy had lost his arm, the doctors unable to save it after infection set in, but he was alive and already asking when he could return to duty. Hartley closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that information settle on his chest. Mitchell would never fire a rifle again, never hold a sweetheart with 2 arms, would carry the mark of that night for the rest of his life. Yet he was alive, and that had to count for something. The medals arrived a week later, delivered by a staff officer who seemed embarrassed by the whole affair. Distinguished Service Orders for Hartley and Williams, military medals for Davies and O'Brien, mentioned in dispatches for several others. The staff officer read the citations formally, praising their extraordinary courage under fire, their successful defense against overwhelming odds, their example of British military excellence. Hartley accepted his medal with numb politeness, wanting to throw the thing away, but knowing such a gesture would dishonor the men who had died. Davies took his with a sardonic smile, later telling Hartley that he would prefer more ammunition and fewer decorations. O'Brien refused to even look at his, leaving it in its box, untouched. The medals felt wrong somehow, an attempt to make sense of something that defied rationality, to impose order and meaning on chaos and survival. Letters from home began arriving, forwarded through military postal channels. Hartley's mother wrote with pride about her son's heroism, having read accounts in the newspapers that bore little resemblance to reality. She included clippings describing the gallant Royal Marines who had charged into enemy forces with fixed bayonets, routing hundreds of Japanese in glorious combat. Hartley read these romanticized accounts with bitter amusement. There had been no charge, no glorious clash of arms. Only desperate men trapped in trenches, fighting for their lives were the only weapons they had left. The newspapers had transformed their nightmare into adventure, their trauma into triumph. He understood why, knew that people needed heroes and victories to sustain morale, but the gap between truth and narrative felt unbridgeable. Mitchell visited before his medical evacuation to India, his empty sleeve pinned neatly, his face still gaunt but carrying something like peace. He thanked Hartley for keeping him steady that night, for not letting him panic, for treating him like a Marine rather than a frightened boy. Hartley did not know what to say, words feeling inadequate, but Mitchell seemed to understand. The younger man said he was proud to serve with them, proud to have held that bridge, proud to have been part of something larger than himself, even if the cost was high. He would return to Manchester eventually, find work with one arm, marry his sweetheart if she would have him, and build a life. But he would never forget that night, never forget the men he had fought beside, never forget what they had endured together. Hartley embraced him carefully, aware of the missing arm, and watched him leave with a lump in his throat. The official after-action reports came next, dry military documents that reduced their experience to statistics and tactical analysis. Enemy casualties estimated at 423 killed, most at close quarters. British casualties 14 killed, 18 wounded out of 32 engaged. Bridge held intact for 72 hours until relief arrived. Tactical success despite numerical inferiority. Recommended for study at officer training schools as example of defensive operations. Hartley read through the reports with detached interest, recognizing the events described but feeling no connection to them. The numbers told a story, but not the real story. They did not capture the terror and exhaustion, the bonds forged in extremity, the moral weight of killing men close enough to touch. The reports would be filed away, studied by future officers, reduced to lessons learned in tactical principles. But the truth of what happened would remain known only to those who had been there. Davy stopped by one evening as the sun set over the hospital compound, bringing news that he was being reassigned to a replacement depot, that the battalion was being rebuilt with fresh troops. Most of the survivors from the bridge were being scattered to different units, their experience valued, but their psychological state questionable. The command wanted them separated. Davies explained, worried that keeping them together would reinforce trauma rather than allow healing. Hartley understood the logic, but hated it nonetheless. These men were his brothers now, bound by shared experience that no one else could understand. Scattering them felt like another loss, another thing taken away. But orders were orders, and they would obey as they always had. Davies extended his hand, and Hartley gripped it firmly, holding on perhaps too long, neither man needing to voice what they both felt. The nightmares continued but slowly changed character. Instead of reliving the fighting, Hartley began dreaming of the aftermath, of walking through the battlefield counting bodies, of looking into the faces of the dead, both enemy and friend. In these dreams, he searched for understanding, for meaning in what they had endured, but found only questions. Had their stand been necessary, or had they simply been abandoned and forced to make the best of impossible circumstances? Were they heroes or victims, or something more complicated than either label allowed? The dreams offered no answers, only the same scenes repeating endlessly, his mind trying to process experience that exceeded its capacity to comprehend. A letter arrived from Sergeant Williams, who had returned to duty with the battalion. He wrote that the bridge had been abandoned 2 months after their fight, the supply route deemed no longer strategically necessary, the position given up without resistance. Williams did not editorialize, simply stated the facts, but Hartley felt the implication like a punch to the stomach. They had fought and died and killed for ground that was ultimately deemed expendable. The knowledge was bitter, yet also strangely liberating. If the ground itself had not mattered, then what remained was simply what they had done for each other, the way they had refused to abandon their brothers, the loyalty and courage they had shown when everything else was stripped away. Perhaps that was meaning enough. Perhaps that was all the meaning war ever offered. Months passed. Hartley eventually returned to duty with a different unit, leading different men through different battles as the campaign in Burma ground onward. He performed his duties competently, professionally, but something had changed in him that night at the bridge. He was more cautious now, more aware of the cost of orders, more willing to question decisions that seemed to value position over people. His superiors noticed, some with approval, others with concern. He would never make general. He realized, lacked the ability to see men as numbers on a map rather than individuals with names and faces and families waiting for them. But he could live with that. He had learned at the bridge what mattered and what did not, and rank felt decidedly unimportant compared to bringing his men home alive. The war eventually ended, as all wars eventually do. Hartley returned to England in late 1946. joining thousands of other veterans trying to reintegrate into civilian society. He found work, eventually married, built a life that looked normal from the outside. But he never spoke about the bridge to anyone except other veterans, those who had their own nightmares and understood without explanation. Once a year, he attended reunions with a few survivors from that night, meeting in quiet pubs to drink and remember. They did not talk much about the fighting itself, found they did not need to. Simply being together, sharing space with the only other people who truly understood, was enough. Davies was always there, still sardonic, still steady. O'Brien came when his health permitted. Mitchell appeared with his wife and eventually his children, living proof that life could continue despite everything. On the 50th anniversary of that night, Hartley returned to Burma at his own expense, traveling to the site of the old bridge. It was gone, of course, replaced by a modern concrete structure, the jungle reclaiming the scars of war. He stood where his command post had been, tried to reconcile memory with reality, and found he could not. The place looked too peaceful, too ordinary, to have been the site of such horror. Perhaps that was appropriate. The world moved on, forgot its wars, allowed nature to heal what men had broken. Only in the minds of those who had been there did the past remain vivid and immediate. Hartley stood in the warm Burmese sunshine, feeling old and tired, and spoke the names of the 14 men who had died there. It was all he could offer them now, remembrance and witness, the acknowledgement that they had lived and fought and mattered. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the ghost behind at last. Back in England, in his final years, Hartley was occasionally contacted by historians and journalists wanting to know about that night, about the famous stand at the bridge where Royal Marines fixed bayonets and killed 400 Japanese at point-blank range. He told them the truth as best he could, though he knew they often heard what they wanted to hear rather than what he actually said. Yes, they had fixed bayonets. No, they had not charged gloriously into the enemy. They had defended their positions because they had no ammunition left and no other choice. They had killed at close quarters because war had forced them into circumstances where such killing became necessary for survival. There was courage involved, certainly, but also desperation and fear and blind obedience to orders. The story was complicated, messy, human, but complications rarely made good copy, so the legend persisted, the tale of heroic Marines charging with cold steel, and Hartley eventually stopped trying to correct it. Let people have their heroes. Those who had actually been there knew the truth, and that would have to be enough. Lieutenant James Hartley died peacefully in his sleep in 1998, surrounded by family, his war long over. At his funeral, 3 elderly men stood together apart from the other mourners, wearing their old regimental ties and medals they rarely displayed. Davies, O'Brien, and Mitchell, the last survivors from that night at the bridge. They did not speak much, did not need to. They had said everything that needed saying decades ago in trenches and blood, and the bonds forged when men faced death together. After the service, they went to a pub, ordered 3 pints, and raised a 4th glass for Hartley and for all the others who had fought beside them that long ago night in Burma. Then they drank in silence, remembering, and when the glasses were empty, they parted ways, knowing they would likely not meet again in this life. But that was acceptable. They had been there. They had held the line. They had not forgotten. And in the end, that was all any soldier could ask. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history's forgotten battles. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on these Marines' incredible stand, and hit the like button to help us bring more of these true stories to light. What other lesser-known military actions would you like us to cover? Let us know below. And thank you for honoring these heroes by listening to their story.